They wore lab coats instead of uniforms, scalpels instead of rifles. In the darkest chapter of modern medicine, Nazi doctors used people, living people, children, prisoners, and the powerless as test subjects in brutal, inhumane experiments. These weren't rogue acts. They were state-sanctioned, systematic, and disguised as science. From freezing in high-altitude trials to sterilization, poisoning, and twin dissections, this is the horrifying legacy of medicine gone mad. Hey guys, Jessica here. If you liked the video, go ahead and like, subscribe, and let's go ahead and get into it. One of the most infamous experiments is the high-altitude and freezing experiments. During World War II, Nazi doctors performed inhumane experiments on prisoners across multiple concentration camps, specifically Dachau, where high-altitude and freezing experiments were conducted. These experiments were used to push the boundaries of the human body and to stimulate conditions often seen in combat amongst German soldiers. Between March and August of 1942, Nazi physicians, primarily Dr. Sigmund Rascher, conducted a series of high-altitude experiments at Dachau concentration camps under the authority of Luftwaffe and Reich Aviation Ministry. The goal was to study how pilots would respond to sudden decompression at extreme high altitudes and to better understand survival chances during aerial combat and emergency ejection. Prisoners, mainly Jews, Roma, and Soviet citizens, were placed in low-pressure chambers that stimulated altitudes up to 20,000 meters, or about 66,000 feet. At these levels, oxygen levels plummet, and atmosphere pressure is nearly non-existent. Subjects were exposed to rapid decompression without oxygen masks. They experienced loss of consciousness, convulsions, brain embolisms, and ruptured lungs. And in many cases, it led to death. Observers documented their symptoms in real time. They often did this by photographing or filming their suffering. Out of approximately 200 human subjects, at least 80 died directly from the procedures. The rest were reportedly executed so their bodies could be dissected for further study. In some cases, victims were autopsied when their bodies were still warm in order to see the internal damage immediately after death. A surviving film shows a prisoner losing consciousness, thrashing violently, and dying under vacuum conditions. The data collected was submitted to high-ranking SS officials and Luftwaffe doctors. From late 1942 to early 1943, Rascher and other Nazi physicians also conducted hypothermia experiments. These experiments were done at Dachau. The tests were intended to find the most effective way to deal with Germans who crashed into cold waters or endured freezing battlefield temperatures. Roughly 300 prisoners were subjected to freezing temperatures through two main methods. The first method was the ice water immersion. Victims were stripped naked and submerged into vats filled with nearly freezing water, often for up to 3 hours. Body temperatures were monitored rectally until they dropped to dangerously low levels, some as low as 26.5 degrees Celsius or 79.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The second method was outdoor exposure. Prisoners were tied down or left laying naked on the ground in sub-zero temperatures, often for up to 14 hours. Researchers recorded their physical conditions. Rewarming techniques were also used. This included hot water baths, heat lamps, massages, alcohol injections, and forced body-to-body contact, including cases where nude women were ordered to warm male victims. These acts were performed without consent and frequently resulted in sexual abuse. Death rates were high. While Nazi doctors officially recorded 80 to 100 deaths, researchers estimate that the true number could be significantly higher. Survivors were often left with permanent cardiovascular, neurological, and physical damage. Dr. Sigmund Rascher was arrested by the SS in 1944 for unrelated offenses and executed in 1945. After the war, his experiments were presented as evidence at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, where they condemned his crimes against humanity. The data obtained in these experiments is ethically tainted and methodologically unreliable. Among the many brutal medical experiments conducted by Nazi physicians during World War II was the sulfonamide and wound infection experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp. They stand out for their deliberate infliction of pain and slow suffering. Beginning in 1942, Nazi doctors began testing the effectiveness of sulfonamide drugs. These were some of the earliest forms of synthetic antibiotics that were available before the use of penicillin. Ravensbrück was the largest women's concentration camp in Nazi Germany, located just outside of Berlin. The purpose was to simulate battlefield injuries and assess whether sulfonamides could be used to prevent or treat wound infections, gangrene, and bone inflammation. These experiments were approved by high-ranking officials in the SS and carried out under the direction of Dr. Karl Gebhardt. He was the personal physician to Heinrich Himmler and chief surgeon of the Waffen-SS. At least 74 female prisoners, mostly Polish political prisoners referred to as the rabbits, were selected for these experiments. Many of them were between the ages of 16 to 30. Deliberate injuries were inflicted surgically. Doctors made deep incisions into the legs or shattered bones, introduced foreign materials such as wood shavings, glass shards, rusty nails, soil, and cloth fibers directly into the wounds to simulate battlefield contamination. To create conditions of infections, they deliberately introduced bacteria. In some cases, they sutured the wound shut and trapped the bacteria inside to worsen the infection. Once infections developed, subjects were treated with various sulfonamide drugs, such as Prontazil or Eulocaine, to observe whether the medication could control the infection or stop it from spreading to the bloodstream. Victims suffered severe swelling, abscesses, necrosis, sepsis, and intense pain. Some were repeatedly operated on, and others had their wounds reopened without anesthesia. Many were left permanently disabled. At least 5 women died as a direct result of these procedures. Others were executed afterwards to prevent them from testifying. In addition to infection studies, some subjects were exposed to artificially induced fractures to test bone regeneration, while others had nerve and muscle tissue removed to study healing rates under drug treatment. In some trials, researchers withheld any treatment at all to create a comparison group, ensuring that some victims would experience maximum suffering with no medical intervention. These experiments were exposed during the Nuremberg doctor trial in 1946 to 1947. Dr. Karl Gebhardt and several of his associates were found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Gebhardt was executed by hanging in 1948. Survivors of the Ravensbrück experiment testified in court and later became symbols of resistance and endurance. Many of the surviving rabbits suffered permanent disabilities, psychological trauma, and infertility. Some underwent dozens of surgeries to repair the damage. The medical findings from these trials were deemed scientifically invalid due to the ethical violations and inconsistent methodology. Among the many medical atrocities committed during the Holocaust, the bone, muscle, and nerve transplantation experiments stand out for their brutal disregard of life. These procedures, performed primarily at Ravensbrück concentration camp, were part of a broader effort of Nazi doctors to explore reconstructive surgery for wounded German soldiers. These experiments began in 1942 under the supervision of Dr. Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the SS, along with the doctors Fritz Fischer and Herta Aberhauser. The aim was to test the regenerative capacity of tissue and the possibility of transplanting bone, muscle, and nerve segments from one part of the body to another, or from one person to another, often to simulate battlefield injury treatment. The primary test site was at Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp where political prisoners, particularly young Polish women, were used as human test subjects. Prisoners were subjected to multiple surgeries under unsanitary and unmedicated conditions. In some cases, entire sections of bone were removed from the arms or legs, most commonly the tibia, fibula, or femur, without any medical necessity. Some women had muscle tissue cut away, while others underwent nerve excision procedures to examine the resulting paralysis, muscle atrophy, or loss of motor function. These were not therapeutic surgeries. The goal was to observe whether the body could regenerate tissue, and whether the transplants could be successful in future applications for injured soldiers. In reality, no effective transplantation occurred. The procedures were purely destructive. Many victims lost the use of their limbs, legs shrank due to missing bone segments, muscles deteriorated, nerves never regenerated. Some subjects developed gangrene, bone infections, or hemorrhaged internally. Survivors often required crutches or prosthetics for the rest of their life. These surgeries were performed without anesthesia or under partial sedation, and pain management was deliberately withheld to monitor natural responses. At least 74 women were subjected to these surgeries, some repeatedly. Many were forced to undergo multiple operations on the same limb. Recovery was hindered by malnutrition, poor sanitation, and lack of follow-up care. Several women died from sepsis or surgical trauma. Others were executed by the SS following the experiments, especially those whose bodies had been mutilated or disabled beyond function. These trials came to light in the Nuremberg doctor trials of 1946 to 1947. Aberhauser received a 20-year sentence, but only served 5 years. She lost her medical license after attempts to resume practice in post-war Germany. Many of the prisoners of these experiments were left with lifelong disabilities, including missing bone structures, paralyzed limbs, and disfigurement. These experiments were obviously scientifically invalid due to ethical violations. These surgeries served no medical purpose. They were conducted under state-sponsored cruelty and racial ideation, using the bodies of prisoners as disposable research material. During World War II, under the cover of medical research, the Nazi regime conducted horrible experiments on humans. Among the most infamous was a series called the Twin Studies. This was carried out at Auschwitz concentration camp. It was led by Dr. Joseph Mengele. His work has become well known as examples of medical abuse in the Holocaust. Dr. Joseph Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May of 1943. He was assigned to conduct genetic and medical research under the authority of the SS. He held a doctorate in medicine and anthropology and was deeply interested in heredity, racial science, and eugenics, ideologies central to Nazi beliefs. Mengele's experiments were part of a larger SS effort known as the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene. He was particularly fascinated with twins. He believed that they could reveal secrets about human genetics and help develop techniques for population control, racial engineering, and selective breeding. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, twins, especially children, were singled out on the ramps during the selection process. Mengele personally oversaw this, often appearing in a white lab coat identifying twins for his study. They were spared from immediate execution, but sent to a special section of the camp called the Zoo or Mengele's Block. These children were promised better conditions, extra food, cleaner barracks, and no forced labor. But the reality was that they were being preserved for human experiments. Between 1,000 and 1,500 twin pairs, particularly Jewish and Romani, were reportedly used in these studies. Most were between the ages of 5 and 18. The experiments ranged from non-invasive measurements to extremely invasive procedures. Initially, Mengele and his team would take exhaustive physical data, eye color, head circumference, facial symmetry, and photographic records. But these studies quickly escalated. Twins were injected with unknown substances, subjected to forced blood transfusions, given deliberate infections such as typhus or tuberculosis, and their eyes were even injected with chemicals. Mind you, these are children. Surgical experiments were also conducted. In some cases, twins were operated on while the other served as a control. If one twin died, Mengele would immediately kill the other to perform comparative autopsies. In some of the worst cases, attempts were made to create artificial Siamese twins by sewing siblings together at the spine, shoulders, or blood vessels. These procedures resulted in agonizing deaths from infection or blood loss. Mengele often developed a friendly relationship with the children, offering candy or playing music while simultaneously planning their mutilation. Survivors later described the experience as deeply confusing and terrifying, lured into trusting a man who would later dissect their bodies without anesthesia. He maintained meticulous records, but most of his research notes were destroyed as the war ended, making full reconstruction of his data impossible. What survives are survivor testimonies, SS documents, and trial records. As the Soviets approached Auschwitz in January of 1945, Mengele fled the camp. He was never captured. Despite being listed as one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals, he escaped to South America, living under various aliases in Argentina, Paraguay, and finally Brazil, where he died in 1979 by drowning. He was never brought to justice. Of the estimated 3,000 children in Mengele's experiments, fewer than 200 are believed to have survived. The twin experiments were condemned at the Nuremberg doctor trials. The scientific community universally rejects any findings from Mengele. His actions remain a symbol of pseudoscience weaponized by ideology, and his victims serve as a lasting reminder of the dangers of medical power unbounded by ethics. The Nazi medical system was not just focused on battlefield injuries. It was rooted in racial ideology. Many of the so-called experiments were conducted in concentration camps and were designed to enforce Nazi views of racial purity. Among the most systematic were the sterilization trials. These trials were aimed at preventing reproduction of those deemed undesirable. Central to Nazi ideology was the belief in a racially pure Aryan master race. Jews, Roma, and Slavic people, and individuals with disabilities were considered racially inferior and genetically defective. This belief led to state policies of forced sterilization and eventually mass murder. Nazis relied heavily on eugenics, a pseudo-scientific movement that sought to improve the human race through selective breeding. Germany's 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditary Diseased Offspring authorized the forced sterilization of individuals with perceived hereditary conditions such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, and congenital blindness. More than 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized in Germany before and during the war. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi doctors conducted human sterilization experiments in concentration camps, most notably at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. These experiments were not just about medical research. They were designed to create mass sterilization techniques that could be applied quickly on a large scale. The goal was to develop methods that could render entire populations, particularly Jews and Romans, infertile without their knowledge. Doctors tested three main methods. First, X-ray radiation. At Auschwitz, SS doctors like Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann used high-intensity X-rays to damage the reproductive organs of both men and women. Victims were exposed to focused radiation on their lower abdomen, often suffering severe burns, internal bleeding, nausea, and infections. Many were sterilized permanently, others died from the exposure. The second was chemical injections. Klauberg also injected caustic substances such as formaldehyde, silver nitrate, and iodine compounds directly into the uterus of female prisoners. The goal was to scar fallopian tubes and destroy the uterine lining. This process caused immense pain, infections, abscesses, and in many cases, death. No anesthesia was used. The third was surgical castration and organ removal. In some cases, particularly among male prisoners, doctors conducted full castration or removal of ovaries without consent. These surgeries were often performed without anesthesia or proper sanitation. Victims who survived the procedure were often left permanently disabled or executed immediately afterwards. Thousands of individuals, especially Jewish women, Roma, and disabled prisoners, were subjected to sterilization. Many were selected because of their ethnicity alone, regardless of their health. At Ravensbrück, many of the sterilization experiments occurred. Women testified after the war, after experiencing multiple procedures, being lied to about treatments, and suffering long-lasting physical and emotional trauma. Few survived, and those who did were often infertile, disfigured, or psychologically broken. The sterilization process robbed them of not only their body autonomy, but also their futures. In addition to sterilization, Nazi doctors also experimented on prisoners to prove racial inferiority. These included anthropometric studies, where skulls were measured to link physical traits to race, eye color experiments, including attempts to change the eye color of Jewish and Roma children through chemical injections, and blood compatibility studies, in which Roma and Black prisoners were forced to receive incompatible blood transfusions to test Aryan versus non-Aryan blood properties. These experiments were pseudoscientific in nature. The goal was never discovery, it was confirmation bias wrapped in medical cruelty. The Nuremberg doctor trial exposed the sterilization experiments to the world. Karl Klauberg was captured and imprisoned by the Soviets. He later returned to Germany and resumed his medical practice before being rearrested in 1955. He died in custody before facing trial. Horst Schumann fled to Africa and was not extradited until the 1960s. He was declared unfit for trial due to illness and died in 1983. These experiments were declared crimes against humanity, and the medical profession today universally rejects the data gathered from them. During the Holocaust, Nazi physicians did not only conduct experiments in the name of military medicine or racial theory. Many of their most brutal trials involved the deliberate infection of prisoners with lethal diseases or testing poisons on human subjects. Acts that served no scientific purpose beyond cruelty and control. Nazi doctors, under the guise of public health and military readiness, conducted disease experiments primarily at Dachau and Auschwitz. These were sponsored in part by the Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces, and the Reich Health Office. The goal was to test vaccines, study the progression of infectious diseases, and determine the efficacy of treatments. In reality, most of these experiments lacked proper methodology, used unwilling subjects, and caused immense suffering. One of the most notorious programs involved typhus, a deadly disease that spread rapidly in overcrowded camps. SS doctors, including Dr. Erland Dingschuler and Dr. Waldemar Hoven, infected prisoners with bacteria responsible for typhus. Victims were injected with infected blood or bitten by lice carriers, then monitored for days or weeks as the illness progressed. Subjects experienced extreme fever, delirium, vomiting, hallucinations, and organ failure. Many died in agony. In total, over 1,000 prisoners were used in typhus trials between 1941 and 1945. Hundreds perished. Many vaccine prototypes from German pharmaceutical companies were tested. None of the results were scientifically valid due to poor documentation and lack of control. At Dachau, prisoners were intentionally infected with malaria by exposure to infected mosquitoes or injections of malaria-infected blood. These trials were conducted under Dr. Klaus Schilling, who had formerly worked in tropical medicine. Over 1,000 people were subjected to malaria experiments. Some were used to test treatments, while others were left untreated to observe the full course of the disease. At Auschwitz, experiments were conducted on tuberculosis, especially targeting children. SS physicians infected healthy individuals with tuberculosis to observe immune responses or progression of illness. Subjects developed chronic coughing, chest pain, fatigue, and lung hemorrhaging, with many dying slowly. Additional experiments involved deliberate infection with yellow fever, smallpox, typhoid, and cholera. These were often done using live cultures injected into the bloodstream or applied to open wounds. Few of the trials were used to design effective cures. Many were performed as biological warfare research, or simply to test human tolerance to infection. In parallel with disease trials, the SS also conducted poison experiments on prisoners. Cyanide compounds, arsenic, atropine, and various chemical agents were tested through ingestion or ejection. Some victims were forced to consume poisoned food or drink under the pretense of a meal. Others were given deadly infections of substances that paralyzed or induced cardiac arrest. In some cases, poison was administered to observe how long it would take the person to die. This was done with the goal of developing efficient killing methods for the SS and Gestapo. Once victims died, autopsies were conducted immediately after to show organ breakdown and chemical absorption. At Auschwitz, experiments were also conducted with mustard gas and other chemical weapons. Victims were exposed to low concentration in sealed chambers or had chemical burns deliberately inflicted onto their skin to study blistering, necrosis, and pain response. None of the trials resulted in useful medical knowledge. Instead, they served as early testing grounds for the mass extermination programs later deployed in the gas chambers. Many of the doctors involved in these experiments were tried during the Nuremberg doctor trials. Dr. Klaus Schilling was executed by U.S. forces in 1946. Dr. Waldemar Hoven was hanged in 1948. Others, like Dr. Erwin Dingschuler, died by suicide before they could be tried. These experiments were obviously declared crimes against humanity. Their data was discarded and scientifically worthless due to lack of consent, poor design, and falsified records. The disease and poison experiments were not medicine. They were tools of terror and genocide, weaponized under the guise of research. Thousands of victims died in agony, nameless, undocumented, and unburied. Survivors, if any, were left with chronic illness, organ failure, disfigurement, and trauma that lasted a lifetime. The Nazi human experiments that were conducted during World War II were not isolated events. They were the systematic product of a state that fused pseudoscience with ideology and medicine with mass murder. Over the course of the Holocaust, thousands of victims were subjected to medical procedures without consent, often resulting in disfigurement, trauma, and death. From high-altitude simulations and hypothermia tests to forced sterilizations, poisonings, twin dissections, and deliberate infection with lethal diseases. These trials were carried out by physicians who had taken an oath to heal, but instead became agents of cruelty. Following the war, the international community responded with the Nuremberg doctors' trial, held in 1946 to 1947. 23 Nazi doctors and administrators were charged with war crimes against humanity. Key figures included Dr. Karl Brandt, who was Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who was an SS surgeon, and Dr. Herta Oberhauser, the only woman who was tried. These doctors were responsible for sterilization, euthanasia, and experimentation on children. They were tried and convicted. 7 were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. Though some were released early, Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, from Auschwitz, escaped prosecution entirely, fleeing to South America where he lived until his death in 1979. Out of these trials came something enduring. The Nuremberg Code, a 10-point framework for ethical human research, has forever changed the landscape of medicine. Its principles include voluntary informed consent, beneficence, doing no harm, qualified researchers, the right to withdraw, and the requirement that all experiments should have the potential to benefit society, never done for arbitrary or political reasoning. Though not in formal law, the Nuremberg Code established the institutional review boards in modern research institutions. Despite the horrific methods used, some Nazi doctors claimed that their work had scientific value. Historians and medical ethicists overwhelmingly reject this. These experiments were methodologically flawed, lacked proper controls, and were based on racial ideology, not genuine inquiry. Very little, if any, legitimate medical process came from these atrocities. Modern science refuses to use the data gathered from Nazi experiments, out of both ethical responsibility and because the findings are fundamentally unreliable. To do otherwise would risk normalizing torture in the name of knowledge. The victims of these experiments were not just anonymous numbers. They were children with matching eyes, young women in pain and terror, men stripped of their dignity and autonomy, and families targeted for extermination. Some survivors tell their stories, often decades later, bearing scars both physical and invisible. Others vanish into mass graves, and no one left to speak their names. The legacy of Nazi medical crimes is not just a cautionary tale. It's a warning about what happens when science serves power, when medicine is weaponized, and when government decides who is worthy of life. It reminds us that consent is sacred. Knowledge should never come at the expense of human dignity. Every medical decision should begin with the question, is this just? I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and like, subscribe, comment. I answer all my comments. I really enjoyed making this video. I'm sorry if I was reading a lot off of my iPad, but there was a lot of information and I didn't want to get anything wrong. If you want to see more of my content, please come back, check on my page. I'm trying to make a video every single week. Hopefully I can get one out every single week, but I do work full-time, so it is hard sometimes. But let me know if you have any ideas for the next video. I really am enjoying doing the medical experiments sort of stuff. I was always interested in that because I was a psychology student for a while, and there's a lot of human experiments in psychology that we talk about. So I do like the experiment side of things, but I also like anything horror, true crime. I'm a criminal justice student now, so anything crimes, I love. So let me know if you have something that you don't see on YouTube a lot and you want somebody to go over it, and I will go over it, I promise, and I'll do my very, very best. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit sick in this video. I have bronchitis, and I have had bronchitis for like a week now, so my voice is a little gone, but I'm still here for you guys. So if you like the video, go ahead and like, subscribe, and remember, stay curious and don't look behind you. Thank you for watching. Bye!